Okay, let's unpack this. We have a massive stack of sources today that explore the hidden, unofficial, and often undeniably true systems that ran history.
It's an incredible collection.
We're zooming in on the mechanics of power, from, medieval royal palaces and their internal terror to the meticulous supply lines that fueled the greatest empire builders.
All the way down to the chaotic, vibrant reality of ancient Rome's working-class streets.
Exactly. It feels like what the listener has curated here goes far beyond the official narratives.
It does. We're looking at the operational procedure of history, the silent, unseen infrastructure that the people in charge often desperately wanted everyone else to overlook.
Right. Our mission today is to cut through that historical noise and focus on what the sources are calling the core paradox. We are
Ah.
separating historical paranoia from, well, historical reality.
And the goal, really, is to see that often the wildest whispers passed around by peasants or gossiped about in
Or
taverns.
feared by nobles.
Exactly. They were, in fact, just the correct observations of what the elite were actively trying to hide.
It's fascinating because the sources consistently show that effective governance, whether you're talking about a 14th century monastery or a 3rd century BC army marching into Asia, it relies completely on these invisible logistical engines.
We're diving into everything from, intelligence networks disguised as religious devotion to supply chains that were just passed off as mere foraging.
And we are starting right in the thick of medieval anxiety with the simple, visceral question. It sounds like sheer paranoia to worry about every single meal, but was every medieval royal truly afraid of their dinner? Was that a daily, quantifiable risk?
It was not just quantifiable, it was a normalized systemic one. The short answer is an emphatic yes. The fear wasn't irrational, it was an acknowledgement of constant, low-grade biochemical warfare.
Biochemical warfare, that's a strong way to put it.
But it's accurate. The risk of poisoning was ever present and entirely ingrained in the political culture of the time because it was the easiest, cheapest, and quietest way to dispose of a rival.
This first section really confirms that the medieval royal kitchen was less a center of culinary excellence and more a literal high-stakes hazard zone.
Oh, absolutely.
Poisoning, as our sources point out, was the preferred low-cost tool of political elimination. Why raise an expensive army when you can just pay a disgruntled cook 10 shillings and get the same result?
Well, the sources describe the royal kitchen as a place where chefs were, and I'm quoting here, unintentionally and occasionally intentionally conducting daily biochemical warfare.
Wow.
Imagine the atmosphere. You have the aromas of roasting meats and expensive spices, but beneath that, there's this palpable fear of someone slipping a powdered herb into the wine flask.
It means the supply chain of a king's dinner was often far more dangerous than the supply chain of his armor.
Precisely. And this is where the infamous role of the taster comes in. The sources call this a prestigious title that sounds noble until you realize it translates directly to, please ingest this mystery stew and let me know if it immediately kills you.
It was the only job in court where surviving your shift was a sign of your professional excellence.
It really was. The job description was essentially human toxicology testing, and it also speaks to the profound distrust within the royal household itself. The taster wasn't just a figurehead, he was a human failsafe.
So what happens if he fails? If the failsafe fails?
If the taster began convulsing, the procedure was brutally pragmatic. The king didn't panic or seek justice. He simply ordered more food from a different vetted cook.
Preferably one who showed absolutely no ambition.
Preferably one who looked less murdery, as one source puts it. That's the core of the operational reality right there. Survival depended on redundancy. If the first layer of defense, the taster, failed, you immediately switched to an alternative supply line.
And this wasn't just a hypothetical risk, right? These are confirmed intentional acts.
Woven into the fabric of high politics. Look at the infamous King John of England.
King John. The one remembered mostly for being petty enough to lose the crown jewels in a swamp.
That's the one. Chroniclers insist that John poisoned at least one rival, and as the sources pointedly observe, this checks out. For a man of John's temperament and lack of conscience, poisoning a relative or a claimant was just another item on the daily to-do list.
Filed right after collect tariffs and before start a minor war.
Exactly. And if England had sort of an amateur league of court poisoning, the Byzantine Empire elevated it into a genuine competitive sport.
They really professionalized it.
Absolutely. The Byzantines standardized assassination by food, especially during periods of succession crisis. Courtiers exchanged poisons and antidotes the way modern executives might exchange stock tips. The court was less a seat of government and more a daily reality TV show where the loser dramatically clutched their stomach mid-banquet.
Sounds exhausting.
Some emperors, we are told, basically gave up on ruling and just waited for their inevitable demise, accepting that the political process was just decided by who managed their kitchen staff better.
And even the church, supposedly a place of piety and safety, wasn't exempt from this. The papal kitchens were notoriously dangerous.
Oh, far from safe. We have records showing that during key papal elections, more than one cardinal dropped dead right before the critical vote. The chroniclers, keenly aware of the danger of speaking treason, would blame these untimely deaths on the will of God.
Which is code.
As the source notes, when you read that phrase in a 13th century manuscript, it's medieval code for "do not ask questions about the strange, powdery residue floating on top of the communion wine."
So the takeaway here is clear. The high security around royal meals wasn't dramatic or melodramatic. Every royal meal was a conspiracy theory just waiting for solid confirmation.
And every bowl or chalice was a real, tangible threat. Paranoia wasn't just an emotion, it was operational reality and a survival strategy.
The sources really drive home the point that the most dangerous weapon in court was rarely the obvious one, the knight or the sword.
No, it was the servant, the cook, or the taster who had access to the larder and a basic knowledge of toxicology. That access, combined with political motivation, made the kitchen the most crucial defensive perimeter.
And if you thought the threat stopped at the kitchen, you'd be sorely mistaken. Our sources now pull back the curtain on the monastic network, the church's continent-wide intelligence organization.
Leveraging piety, literacy, and absolute freedom of movement for espionage. Forget the quiet garden, this was the original CIA in robes.
This functional analysis of the monastic orders is a fascinating piece of synthesis.
It is. Monks were incredibly effective spies because they possessed exactly the qualities required for covert intelligence gathering in the Middle Ages. They were literate, which was rare. They were trained to observe human behavior.
Specifically sin, which is highly useful information.
Exactly. They were quiet, and, critically, they had unparalleled mobility.
They could move freely and instantly between major settlements. No one inspected them. That white or brown robe was the ultimate VIP pass for a spy. Why were they exempt from that scrutiny?
The sources confirm it was a blend of legal privilege and deep-seated religious terror. Legally, the church had its own judicial system, and touching a servant of God was often deemed sacrilege.
But practically speaking,
Practically, no local lord, customs officer, or castle guard wanted to risk eternal damnation, or even just a very bad reputation, for harassing a quiet, traveling friar. They were just waved through checkpoints.
so they traveled from abbey to abbey, supposedly collecting alms or copying manuscripts.
But in reality, they were collecting gossip disguised as confessions, observing troop movements, and noting which noble houses seemed suspiciously well-stocked. They were historians, yes, but the more accurate term, as the sources suggest, is intelligence analysts with excellent handwriting.
I love that. And within this vast network, certain orders became specialist operative.
Yes, the Dominicans, for example, were singled out as the worst offenders, or if you prefer, the best analysts.
It depends on which side you're on.
Right. Their founding mission was to root out heresy, which meant they had institutional permission to interview villagers, monitor local officials, and watch people with the intensity of a judgmental cat waiting for a mouse to twitch.
So if a medieval man sneezed near the wrong Bible passage, a Dominican friar would magically appear, asking follow-up questions about the theological implication of his respiratory habits.
You're not far off. And kings quickly realized the value of this existing efficient system. They paid monks secretly to report on court scandals, troop movements, and whether their rivals were planning a suspicious feast.
A feast being medieval code for a potential uprising.
Precisely. It was the medieval subscription service for strategic intelligence. And the information flowed because the network was comprehensive, trusted, or feared, and decentralized.
The Inquisition only formalized this, right?
It created an entire bureaucratic institution dedicated to gathering incriminating information. And the reports were incredibly detailed, ranging from serious political threats and localized rebellions to the utterly mundane.
Give us an example of that mundane detail they collected.
The reports could be astonishingly specific. One reads, Brother Gregory reports the shoemaker's wife was seen at night carrying suspicious herbs from the north field, possibly for use in a pagan ritual. further surveillance needed.
Wow. That's a granular level of observation.
It wasn't just about high treason, it was about maintaining complete social control and information dominance. Villagers whispered that the monasteries knew everything about the local region, and the sources confirmed their fear was entirely justified.
But the shadow rule went beyond just spying. Our sources also confirmed the unsettling reality of the cloistered assassin. Monasteries housing literal discreet hitmen. This sounds like something out of a novel.
It sounds like fiction, but it was profoundly practical. These men often joined a non-vocal, non-intellectual order of brothers, lay brothers, not out of spiritual calling, but for the convenience of the infrastructure.
A monastery offered shelter, food, legal protection.
And crucially, the ability to travel freely between kingdoms without attracting suspicion. The religious garment was the perfect cover for a discreet contractor.
And the clients were high-level nobles who needed plausible deniability. Why hire a loud, bragging mercenary knight who would trip over his own armor and tell everyone in the next tavern about the job?
The silence was the key selling point. The sources suggest that these silent service operatives were often used to eliminate rivals quietly, making the death look like an accident or an illness or a sudden dramatic fall from a window.
That old classic.
Exactly. Lay brothers were preferred because they performed manual labor, meaning they had the physical strength needed, few witnesses to their movements, and a perfect excuse for traveling. I am collecting alms for the abbey, they'd claim, except they also had a discreetly placed dagger under their habit.
The evidence for this must be hard to find, but it's there.
It's scattered but consistent through the chronicles, hints of mysterious deaths, rivals conveniently falling into rivers, landowners suddenly repenting and vanishing into a remote abbey, never to be heard from again.
And there were internal complaints, too.
We even find internal monastic complaints. Abbots would write to each other about brothers failing to observe spiritual discipline. That was code for, someone keeps sneaking out after matins and returning covered in mud and a suspicious smell, and we don't know where he's going, but we also are asking.
So the kingdoms tolerated this operation because monasteries offered a solution for complex problems.
They handled elimination and intelligence quietly, efficiently, and with minimal cleanup required. Which explains why the villagers were absolutely right to whisper that some monks were far more dangerous than their sermons suggested.
The ultimate chilling takeaway here is that the most dangerous weapon in the Middle Ages wasn't the sword or the crossbow.
It was a well-placed Dominican friar with a very good memory, impeccable travel papers, and a discreet understanding of how to make a political rival disappear.
Speaking of powerful institutions that vanished, let's turn to the Knights Templar. Medieval people accused them of everything. Guarding massive treasure, worshipping a severed head called Baphomet, controlling kings, and interestingly, inventing banking.
And the incredible thing, as the sources reveal, is that much of their power was rooted in a practical yet highly secretive operational reality. The Templars didn't suffer from a lack of faith. They suffered from a terrible curse. Unparalleled success.
They became too big to fail, and then they failed.
Exactly. They started as noble protectors of pilgrims, but within a century, they had transformed into an organization so wealthy and logistically adept that kings had to organize their national budgets around the Templars' financial power.
They owned castles, vast tracts of land, fleets of ships, more money than half of Europe combined. The sources call them a medieval combination of the Navy SEALs, the Federal Reserve, and that one global shipping conglomerate.
That's a perfect description. Their sheer scale of wealth terrified the monarchies, especially those who were perpetually broke, like Philip V of France. Was the rumor of them guarding a massive treasure hoard true? Yes. But the treasure wasn't a room full of gold bars.
It was the financial infrastructure itself, the ability to move and multiply that wealth.
Precisely. This brings us to the core financial conspiracy, the one that was absolutely true and truly revolutionary. They established the first widespread, Europe-wide banking system, which is an astonishing logistical achievement for an age that struggled to accurately weigh grain.
So how did this system work mechanistically?
Their innovation wasn't inventing money, it was inventing a secure, liquid system of credit. The key was the letter of credit. A pilgrim in England could deposit gold with a Templar house, and in return, they received a coded document.
And they could cash that in somewhere else.
They would travel to Jerusalem or any major port, present the letter, and a Templar house there would pay them the equivalent amount, minus a small fee.
So the money itself never traveled. This eliminates the single biggest risk of medieval travel: highway robbery.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that the moment physical gold was taken off the road, the Templars de-risked commerce and pilgrimage across the entire continent. They operated secure vaults, kept incredibly complex coded records, which to the common person looked like mystical sigils, and moved capital with an efficiency that terrified monarchs.
And it was this efficiency and total secrecy that fueled the wild rumors about Baphomet and mysterious rituals.
Of course. They met in private, conducted ceremonies at night, and swore oaths that no outsider could witness. Naturally, the medieval mind could not accept boring, practical reasons for extreme secrecy. People needed drama.
When the reality was just organizational discipline.
The truth was that the rituals involved organizational discipline, confessions, and oaths necessary for a military order managing vast global assets. But secrecy around their military codes, their encryption of financial ledgers, and their banking procedures was essentially indistinguishable from witchcraft to the medieval mind.
So the irony is that when Philip IV, needing their money, arrested and tortured them into confessing to these wild accusations, he wasn't entirely wrong about the secrecy and the power they wielded.
He was technologically illiterate about their operation, but strategically spot on. The Templars did hold a vast treasure, their liquid capital. They did run a secretive parallel empire of finance, and they did keep proprietary knowledge hidden. It wasn't demonic knowledge, it was double-entry bookkeeping and currency exchange rates.
But for the feudal mind, effective bookkeeping and dark magic are practically the same thing.
Their operational secrecy was what allowed them to bypass traditional power structures, making them a rival state in everything but name.
Let's move to the Black Death, which began ravaging Europe in 1347. This presented a very different kind of conspiracy, the idea that the church knew far more about the plague than it publicly admitted.
And this, too, disturbingly, had a kernel of truth about information asymmetry. The church and the higher clergy possess an undeniable institutional and life-saving advantage: information control.
They were networked across the entire continent.
Right. They had access to merchant letters detailing port closures, medical reports from various urban centers, and incoming ship logs that ordinary people never saw. They knew when outbreaks were spreading and when trade routes were collapsing, knowledge that was moving far slower than the plague itself.
And while the public was largely ignorant, the self-preservation response of the hierarchy was striking.
It was. They used that information to save themselves. Bishops were quietly packing their bags and relocating to countryside villas with better airflow and fewer people. Monasteries that could afford to lock down did so immediately, sealing themselves off from the infected population.
So they prioritized their own survival.
They did, using the information advantage they held, often to the detriment of their flocks. They even communicated with each other in coded warnings to prevent local panic.
What did those sound like?
The clergy warn each other in letters using highly specific yet veiled phrases. For example, the ship brings dark tidings, which the sources interpret as medieval code for "do not go outside, the plague has arrived, and everything is on fire." They communicated strategically, using religious metaphors to mask tactical, life-saving logistical movements.
And even more suspicious, the sources note, were the quarantine orders. Some were issued before the plague visibly reached a specific region.
That implies someone, somewhere, was acting on non-public intelligence.
This is the insider trading component of the conspiracy.
It is. Venetian traders, who were hyper-aware of shipping delays, wrote about receiving strange warnings from church officials to avoid certain Mediterranean ports a week or even 2 weeks before the plague officially erupted there. That's not divine foresight.
No, that is information being acted upon before it became public knowledge.
Allowing the powerful to escape while the general population remained ignorant. Meanwhile, the official public advice they handed down was not just unhelpful, but arguably detrimental.
They told people to repent, pray harder, burn herbs.
Or, my favorite, avoid excessive joy. Joy, apparently, was considered a plague risk, somehow making the body more susceptible. The church, facing a crisis it couldn't solve, prioritized avoiding societal panic and protecting its own structure by withholding timely warnings. The conspiracy here wasn't malicious plotting, but a devastating failure of public communication rooted in self-interest and information asymmetry.
Stepping away from the royal and papal centers, the sources also confirm smaller, localized conspiracies that were rooted in the desperate reality of medieval life, starting with so-called pagan cults. Were there secret groups practicing forbidden rituals in the forest?
Yes and no. The church imagined these robed, organized sorcerers, but the reality of these peasant cults was often far less sinister than the panic suggested. They were illegal support groups, not satanic plots.
So it was really happening.
The reality was a handful of exhausted peasants sneaking into the forest to chant old songs, burn ancestral herbs, and desperately hope the crops would stop failing.
Like the famous example, the Benandanti in northern Italy. They claim they left their bodies at night to fight witches and protect the crops.
And when the Inquisition interrogated them, they didn't get the standard forced confessions of devil worship. They got baffled inquisitors listening to earnest claims of fighting against evil magic. The sources frame this as medieval Avengers roleplay because the inquisitors genuinely didn't know what to do with people who sincerely believed they were protecting the village, not cursing it.
It was a survival strategy, not a plot.
A desperate merging of pagan fertility rites with vague Christian concepts, misinterpreted as high treason.
Okay, let's move to the bizarre-sounding theory of faked royal deaths. A conspiracy that actually came true often enough to be a genuine threat.
This phenomenon was entirely possible due to the abysmal state of medieval record-keeping. Records were handwritten, easily forged, and often destroyed. A death certificate was often just the local priest wrote it down before spilling wine on it.
So when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II died in 1250,
It immediately led to persistent rumors he was merely hiding, waiting to return. A medieval equivalent of Elvis sightings. And you have the mystery of Richard of Eastwell, a man in 15th century England who claimed to be Richard III's secret son. He was skilled, spoke Latin, had royal bearing,
but no one could prove it.
and the sources confirm that sometimes rulers truly did flee, fake their deaths, or try to escape assassination by disguising themselves. A king in plain clothes wasn't always a conspiracy theory. It was sometimes a safety strategy.
Now, what about the poisoned wells conspiracy? This terrorized villagers during sieges and plagues.
During sieges, it was standard procedure dumping dead animals and toxic plants. But away from battle, it led to horrific accusations, particularly targeting Jewish communities during the Black Death.
But here's the brutal scientific irony.
The irony is that away from the battlefield, most wells were poisoned. But they were poisoned by nature, by bacteria, and by poor sanitation, not by organized enemies. Rain washed waste into the groundwater, rats fell in, moldy leaves fermented. Most wells were just unfiltered holes in the ground surrounded by people who bathed once per year.
So they were correct that the water was dangerous, but wrong about the source.
Exactly. They blamed outsiders for what was, in fact, localized gastroenteritis and bacterial contamination.
Finally, we turn to the vast, functioning shadow economy, the unofficial system of deals, illegal markets, and bribes that ran beneath the wonderfully dysfunctional surface of feudal law.
This was the crucial hidden system that everyone pretended didn't exist while simultaneously participating in it daily. This unofficial economy was often the only part of the entire system that worked consistently.
And thieves' guilds actually existed.
They did, and they were astonishingly organized. They didn't just steal, they organized territories, settled disputes, enforced territorial boundaries, and even punished independent thieves for violating professional courtesy.
So they created their own HR department and judicial system because medieval law enforcement was useless or bought out.
They provided stability where the state did not. Smuggling was endemic: salt, wine, wool, iron. The king's tariffs were treated less as a mandatory law and more as a polite suggestion no one took seriously.
So this underground system was the true engine that kept commerce flowing.
Absolutely. These medieval secrets showed that power, whether royal, religious, or economic, relies fundamentally on hidden, highly efficient logistical systems.
That's our key transition. We shift now from the covert intelligence and hidden economics of the Middle Ages to a very different kind of hidden system, the meticulous, ruthless logistical planning that enabled Alexander the Great to conquer the known world. We're moving from the logistics of secrecy to the logistics of scale.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the sheer scale is almost unimaginable without modern technology. We always focus on Alexander's tactics, but our sources confirm his victories were the result of ruthless, precise logistics.
He wasn't leading an army. He was commanding a moving city of nearly 40,000 men.
And the scale is just astronomical for the ancient world. The sheer volume of matter he moved across vast distances year after year is what defines his success.
When on the march, this column stretched for several kilometers. It included not just soldiers and cavalry, but sophisticated support staff. Engineers, siege specialists, medics, blacksmiths, scribes, and critically, thousands upon thousands of pack animals.
Mules, camels, horses. each one loaded down.
And they had no engines, no reliable maps in the modern sense, yet they coordinated movement across harsh terrain with uncanny precision.
And Alexander refined his strategy to maximize speed. This speed was intentional. It was a deadly weapon.
Speed was paramount. His army traveled extraordinarily light compared to the slow-moving, heavily reliant Persian armies. Soldiers carried only essentials: weapons, armor, a cloak, a few days' worth of milled grain, and a simple cooking pot.
Tents were for officers only.
Right. Ordinary soldiers slept under the open sky. This intentional reduction in baggage weight allowed for an operational tempo that broke enemies psychologically before they even arrived at the battlefield.
But let's get into the staggering math of the fuel crisis. Daily feeding a force of 40,000 men, plus thousands of horses and pack animals. It required constant acquisition of roughly a kilogram of grain per soldier per day.
That's 40 metric tons of food per day just for the men.
That is a logistics crisis waiting to happen every single morning.
Before any glory, before any battle, there were dozens of tons of barley and wheat that had to be hauled, bought, or foraged. Alexander's genius wasn't just in generalship. It was in his ability to manage this constant, critical flow of caloric energy.
His logistical core had to secure and move enough grain to fill an enormous warehouse every 4 days across deserts and mountains.
It's unbelievable.
So how do they handle this constant acquisition? The sources say Alexander favored diplomacy over destruction, which seems entirely counterintuitive for a massive conqueror.
It was pure self-interested logistics. He knew he couldn't carry enough food for a year. Therefore, he had to make the land feed his army.
So quartermasters went ahead of the main force.
Securing agreements with towns and villages for grain, fodder, and livestock, Alexander realized that securing a town's loyalty meant a continuous, strengthened supply line for months.
Whereas burning that town today meant no food tomorrow.
Forcing his own army to starve later, he preferred to make cooperation profitable.
But the real logistical nightmare wasn't the men, it was the cavalry. A war horse, an essential part of his tactical advantage, ate as much as 10 men.
The horses dictated the routes as much as strategy did. They needed available grasslands, vast amounts of pasture. In barren regions, the army marched with its food, not in wagons, but alive.
Herds of sheep and cattle, a living supply line.
A living supply line that moved on 4 legs, eating the sparse vegetation under them and feeding the army as needed. The route had to be a function of agricultural viability.
Alexander's treated a terrain like a master sailor treats the wind, mapping every river well and past days ahead. The complexity of crossing the Hindu Kush, for instance, sounds less like a military feat and more like an exercise in mathematical calm.
It was pure survival engineering performed at a military pace. The sheer elevation and narrow passes required meticulous planning. They built temporary roads, established pre-prepared fires for warmth,
and redistributed heavy packs across animals to prevent them from slipping down cliffs.
But the deserts, like the Syrian steppe and the dreaded Gedrosian desert, were even more punishing. Movement depended entirely on the intelligence gleaned from local guides, often bribed or interrogated, who knew the hidden springs and wadis that were otherwise invisible.
And this brings us to the nervous system of the entire campaign, the intelligence network.
The network was absolutely essential to predicting supply viability. Light cavalry scouts covered vast areas, up to 50 kilometers a day, mapping terrain, checking water sources, and watching for hostile forces.
They were complemented by informants and a large contingent of interpreters.
Skilled in Aramaic, Persian, and dozens of regional dialects necessary to interface with local suppliers and guides. Alexander understood that a single coerced local guide tells you where you want to go, but a willing cooperative guide tells you where you need to go to survive.
So he incentivized truth-telling and loyalty to secure reliable supply intelligence.
Precisely. He leveraged diplomacy and protection to turn local leaders into willing contributors to his logistical machine. Without this steady stream of detailed, reliable intelligence, the phalanx would have walked blind into logistical ruin.
Now, moving from the quick march to the prolonged siege, taking a city like Tyre was fundamentally an engineering and logistical task. The army had to transform overnight.
From a striking military unit into a construction workforce. And that required organizing massive quantities of raw materials, primarily timber, hauled by specialized labor detachments who marched with axes and saws instead of spears.
Alexander's engineers were not secondary staff. They were vital tacticians.
They analyzed walls, calculated trajectory angles for artillery, and built towering siege defenses while under constant fire. Siege logistics required running a massive, mobile industrial workshop under continuous hostile action.
And a siege meant stopping, which created a whole new immediate supply challenge, especially since the surrounding area might already have been depleted.
Exactly. When stationary, foraging decreases dramatically, but consumption remains high. Alexander pre-planned extensive temporary supply depots and ensured continuous protected convoys brought grain and fodder from distant secure regions.
The pressure he exerted during sieges was a race against the logistical clock.
He needed the city to surrender before his own complex supply chain broke down from prolonged stationary demand.
Finally, we look at conquering the massive rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus. These were not just geographical obstacles, they were logistical miracles requiring immense planning.
Each major river crossing was a feat of civil engineering. For shallow rivers, engineers measured depth, and soldiers linked shields in tight formations to act as human anchor chains.
But for deeper water,
They used ingenuity. Massive rafts made of lashed reeds, logs, or famously inflated animal skins carried equipment and men. Artillery had to be dismantled, carefully ferried across, and then reassembled on the other bank before local opposition could mobilize.
the Hydaspes crossing against King Porus in 326 BC is often cited as a military masterpiece, but the sources frame it as a masterclass in psychological logistics.
It was pure deception rooted in logistical timing. Alexander repeatedly marched his troops up and down the riverbank, making a show of preparing to cross at multiple points, confusing Porus. Then he launched the actual surprise crossing from a hidden upstream island during a major rainstorm.
He didn't conquer the river by bravery alone.
He did it by calculated preparation, engineering skill, and a disciplined choreography that turned dangerous waters into stepping stones. And once he controlled these waterways, his massive river fleets became mobile, floating supply depots, turning rivers from obstacles into highly efficient logistical highways.
So Alexander's logistical engine, even when strained to its limit through Asia, proved that the supply chain, the flow of grain and information, and the quality of the engineering core, not just the sword, determines the fate of empires.
That's it.
Okay, so we leave the military machine of the ancient West and shift now to a completely different kind of logistical system. The highly refined management of pleasure and emotional atmosphere in Song Dynasty China, specifically in Qifeng's pleasure quarters.
This is a jarring but necessary leap because it shifts our focus from brute survival logistics to the logistics of emotional stability and refinement for the ruling class.
Qifeng's floating world was deliberately crafted to feel like stepping into a painting a world where nothing harsh or commercial was allowed to penetrate the illusion.
It was an exercise in pure atmospheric engineering. The sources describe the streets twisting like painted ribbons, glowing with lanterns of lacquered red and jade. The constant, noisy pressure of the city was completely eliminated.
The moment you stepped inside,
The clatter of the market was replaced by the soft, rhythmic stroke of the zithers and the delicate tapping of wooden blocks. The atmosphere was everything. It smelled specifically of fresh barley tea, fine plum wine, and imported sandalwood incense.
scents chosen for their calming and clarifying effects,
The careful curation created the illusion that time itself had loosened its grip.
and the tea houses weren't just places to drink, they were listening rooms, social theaters, sanctuaries.
They were necessary operational sites. Scholars debated poetry, high officials sought refuge in elegance, and, crucially, powerful merchants negotiated deals away from the oversight of the state. These spaces provided a vital release valve for the intense pressure of the capital city.
The true operational artists, however, were the courtesans, not merely companions, but professionals trained from childhood in poetry, music, painting.
And the subtle, crucial art of emotional presence and psychological comfort. Their residences, the flower pavilions, were tranquil sanctuaries, often featuring meticulously maintained koi ponds, moon gates, and gardens.
And their appearance was a composition in itself.
Silk robes dyed in sock-specific hues, hair styled into elegant loops. But their true logistical value was in subtlety. Reciting Tang poems so clearly that each syllable felt like falling dew, or painting fluid calligraphy that seemed to breathe.
They offered more than entertainment. They offered respite, wit, and confidence.
A high official could visit, talk about the burden of his office, and leave feeling lighter, with his confidence restored, knowing he had been met with intelligence and grace.
So the logistics of the pleasure quarter centered entirely on the efficient delivery of tranquility and high-level emotional intelligence.
Which the ruling class needed to function. And this artistry extended to the theaters, the soul of the quarters, blending poetry, martial arts, dance, and music. They offered escape of the purest kind.
For the audience, a well-told story or a beautiful song offered the ultimate service, lifting a person out of their everyday weight.
And placing them gently into another, less demanding realm. The logistics were dedicated to maintaining illusion.
The efficiency of Qifeng, then, was in crafting illusion and emotional comfort as a necessary service for the elite. Now we take a jarring leap across continents and time to a city that offered zero illusion, Rome. We shift to the Suburra, where efficiency was measured only in brute survival.
The contrast is extreme, and it is purposeful. The Suburra didn't welcome you gently. It hit you in the face with a wall of noise, smoke, heat, and raw humanity.
It was the beating, chaotic heart of Rome's working class, separated from the respectable districts only by a few marble steps, but spiritually an entirely different universe.
It was a world of staggering density, sprawling beneath the towering, flimsy, insular tenement blocks, often 5 to 7 stories high, that leaned over the narrow streets like crooked, hungry giants.
And these buildings are crucial to understanding Roman urban logistics. They were built rapidly and cheaply by cynical landlords,
Prioritizing maximum rent over basic safety. They were fire-prone, structurally unsound, and packed with families squeezed into single rooms. This was the engine room of the empire, home to the essential labor porters, builders, scribes, gladiators, and sex workers.
You could buy anything here: cheap food, stolen goods, or the services of a gladiator for intimidation.
Let's talk about the structural mechanism that made them so dangerous. The main problem was material and height. The insulae used thin brick and timber frames. The higher floors were built with lighter, even cheaper materials, often resting on shaky foundations below,
So fires were constant.
spreading instantly through the thin wood and often resulting in entire blocks collapsing. And imagine the logistical nightmare of a 7-story building with no internal plumbing. Water had to be carried up manually, multiple times a day.
That constant physical labor added to the sheer grinding exhaustion of life there.
And if the Suburra had temples, they were the taverns, the true gathering places of the district. They were the city's gossip furnace, always full, loud, and smoky.
They were the essential communications network.
News traveled faster here than it did across the Senate floor. If a politician had embarrassed himself or a new shipment of grain had arrived, Suburra knew the details within hours, because drunken conversation loosened secrets and the tavern keepers remembered everything.
At night, the district sharpened. This was the highly visible night economy, where crime and sex work were essential businesses.
The logistics of sex work in Rome were diverse, from a mat on the floor behind a curtain to luxury houses with intricate mosaics. Sex workers were a diverse mix of slaves, freedmen, and fugitives from across the empire.
And beyond the commerce, they were essential intelligence gatherers.
Soldiers bragged about campaigns, merchants whispered about supply routes, and their aggregated knowledge made them a valuable, though unofficial, intelligence asset.
But the danger was everywhere. Pickpockets, organized gangs.
The gangs controlled the gambling dens, ran protection rackets, and regulated stolen goods. The official city guard, the urban cohorts, avoided patrolling Suburra after dark because the narrow, congested streets and the maze-like rooftops heavily favored the locals.
Suburra handled its own raw, immediate justice.
The entire district was characterized by a deep mutual distrust with the officials meant to control it, meaning the shadow systems, the gangs, the tavern keepers, the smugglers, were the true regulatory bodies.
Finally, the insulae themselves represent the harsh, fundamental, yet resilient reality of Rome.
They were the vertical slums, cheap, dark, lacking sanitation, and plagued by noise that traveled through the thin walls as if they didn't exist. Fire was the oldest enemy, an ever-present, terrifying possibility.
Yet, despite the chaos and the danger, these rickety towers pulsed with community.
Resilience and fierce pride. Suburrans knew that their labor built the city's monuments, fed its markets, and carried its burdens. The district was chaotic, dangerous, and exhausting, yet it was the absolutely irreplaceable engine of the Roman Empire.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We started this deep dive with medieval kings worried about the poison soup placed before them, and ended with Roman laborers surviving rickety tenements 5 stories up.
It's been quite a journey.
The source material has taken us from the secrets of the clergy to the meticulous engineering of empire. The connective tissue across every segment, across every time period, is the pervasive power of functional hidden systems.
That is the essential insight for you, the learner. Whether it was the covert, quiet intelligence network of the Dominicans operating beneath the veneer of piety, or the ruthless financial infrastructure of the Templars disguised as a holy military order.
Or the precise mathematical movements of Alexander's quartermasters, assuring constant caloric supply across the Hindu Kush.
Or even the delicate social and atmospheric structure of Kaifeng's courtesans providing vital emotional escape. The true operations of history rarely match the official, curated story.
You wanted knowledge quickly and thoroughly, and what stands out is that to be truly well-informed, you must look past the obvious elements, the battles, the crowns, the marble monuments, and focus on the underlying logistics.
You have to trace the spy networks, the supply lines, and the shadow economies because those are the engines that actually keep empires and people alive and functioning.
It forces us to redefine what we consider power.
Power isn't just decreed from a throne, it is managed by the unseen. It's managed by the quiet movement of grain, by the discreet delivery of intelligence, by the secure transfer of credit across continents.
Or by the ability to offer a few hours of peaceful rested in a perfectly scented tea house.
These functional elements, the hidden infrastructure, are what determine survival and success.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you finish up this deep dive.
This raises an important question. If we accept that the most functional parts of the medieval world were its secrets, and the most efficient parts of Alexander's empire were its supply chains, what functioning, essential hidden systems are operating around us today, in modern commerce, in information flow, or in logistical infrastructure, that we simply assume are just how things work, but are in fact the true silent orchestrators of our modern reality?